Hello there. You're all very welcome. Thanks for coming. My name is Steve. Thank you for your time. And then, I hope this is going to be a really useful session for you. FYI, we're recording this, so just keep that in mind. And please keep your questions to the end. You can pop them in the chat box if you like, and we'll do our very best to answer them as best we possibly can. So before I get into the introductions and introduce Joey, I just want a quick little section on why we're doing this at all. So our mission at Charity Entrepreneurship is for more highly effective charities to exist in the world. And we've been busy building our foundation program, which is a new program specifically for funders to upskill them. And we've also been busy writing a book on how to be a high impact funder. So we've been really getting into the weeds on this topic and understanding how funders, in particular funders of somewhat smaller projects, can improve their efficacy. And we've grown our seed network as well, and we've reached a secure kind of steady state, both as our own funding for our own organization and as one that rallies funding around behind newer high potential organizations. And on top of that, we've been heavily involved in the funding of new EA projects over the past 4 years, significantly involved with over like 50 important fundings and directly involved in like 20. And it occurred to us that we're pretty unique in terms of our position and experience in terms of the funding landscape. There's a lot of talk of funding overhangs in EA, but with only 4% of over 1,700 proposals to FTX being funded. So just let me say that again, 1,700 proposals to FTX and about 4% of them got funded. On top of that, EAIF, the infrastructure fund, are making it very clear that they want more applications. We feel that there's some misconceptions and a lot of time being wasted out there trying to get funding while not really understanding how it all works. So we thought it might be useful to share a little bit about our experience. I'm Steve Thompson. I work with Charity Entrepreneurship. I have a background in entrepreneurship and in corporate training. But more recently, I started the charity through the CE incubation program. It's called Training for Good, and we're an EA meta charity. And I also work with CE in searching for bright talent. So I'm going to introduce or let Joey introduce himself now. So hopefully Joey is there. And can figure out where the mute button is.
Great. Sorry, I didn't have permission. Yes. So I am Joey. I'm the co-founder of Charity Entrepreneurship, also background in nonprofit entrepreneurship more broadly. So have founded a few different projects before Charity Entrepreneurship. But when we realized that there was a lot of hurdles that could easily be overcome by a meta organization to help new and effective projects get started, Charity Entrepreneurship was kind of the natural thing. So as Steve mentioned, kind of getting a little bit into charity entrepreneurship, we've supported a really wide range of projects now across a bunch of different cause areas and across a bunch of different kind of organizations. 23 organizations so far through our program and over 2.5 million in seed grants. We've helped a lot of these projects grow well past that in terms of size and organizational scope and capacity. So many of them have now gone international or become kind of on track to getting Gibble recommended or ACE recommended or kind of whatever the top status is in their various field of choice. Generally, the advice that we're going to be talking about is going to be stuff that's cross-applicable, so applies across any particular cause area, although there is a lot of intervariation between different organizations in different sub-areas. We're going to try to kind of hit the stuff that's going to be a little bit more applicable to any sort of scenario. Thanks, Steve.
So we're going to give a very brief introduction to fundraising with some quick thoughts, where to fundraise from, how to do it, like either in person or in writing, who to ask, the funding landscape. So we're going to very briefly map out some of the key funders in the space. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And then the meat of this talk will really be what we've learned and what works and also what doesn't, and when even indeed to say no. And then we'll wrap up with summary conclusion. And if at all possible, if we have time at the end, we will have some time for Q&A. Obviously, do ask questions throughout. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box as best I can. And anything that I think is like applicable at the moment, I'll try and interject with that. But at the same time, it's probably better just to essentially wait till the end and then we can see what are the main themes of the questions. But do throw them in the chat box as we go. In terms of how this presentation is put together or this piece of information is put together, think of it as being like a small section of it is the content in the slides. And then the bulk of it is coming from the experience, particularly that Joey has had over the last number of years. But the slides themselves, hopefully, will be a kind of a useful resource after the fact. There's some slides with quite a lot of material in them and some links and stuff, and I'll be sharing the slide deck afterwards. So we're not going to go through all of the slides in completion during the presentation, because that's just redundant, and you can read them afterwards, and that'll be how it goes. So from time to time, I'll kind of skip through a few slides saying what's on them, and then you can refer back to them afterwards. So I hope that makes sense and leaves you with a valuable resource. So first off, quick introduction to fundraising. I've launched my own project with two co-founders, and we've been through some of this experience ourselves very directly. And a lot of the feelings towards fundraising can be like, it's scary, you know. Oh, sorry, this isn't wrong with the slides. There we go. It can be scary, but it doesn't need to be. You know, you get to focus on all of the things that you're good at and all of the strengths of your project and why it's so important. And funders are generally on your side. They want you to succeed, and they want to fund things. They're constantly asking, hey, you know, what are you doing? How can we get involved? So they want to hear from you, and they want to have impact, and their route to impact is through you. So I think that's just a nice reframe. If they're talking to you, it's probably because they have similar values and want to be convinced. So I remember an old sales manager of mine years ago saying that if they have you in the room, it's because they want to say yes. The deal is there. You just need to not put in the way any barriers. So they're kind of on board already if they've got you in the room. Second point being, the less you are looking for, and the further you're going to go, you're going to be able to stretch it, the easier and less time consuming it'll be to raise funds. So start lean and scrappy. Don't spend ages looking for money. You'll have more time to work on your project and get better results. And that's what makes it easier to get more funding. So get the foot in the door and then build up from there will be a good generalized piece of advice that a lot of people seem to back. And then mostly, and we'll be coming back to this a few times, is really focusing on cost-effective impact. Think of the funders as wanting to buy outcomes or take qualified bets on big wins. So the best fundraising is building great programs and projects and demonstrating progress, and not trying to get all of your funding in advance of being able to demonstrate that. So it's not about having a great pitch deck, it's about having a really great project. Yeah. So it feels like a television studio or something. Back over to Joey.
Yeah. Great. So I'm going to start with a little bit of details on where to fundraise, kind of right at the beginning when you're first building up a donor pool or a donor network and you don't necessarily kind of have that established. So first, we'll talk about in-person fundraising. A lot of fundraising is still done kind of face-to-face, in person, when you're able to kind of look in someone's eyes and talk to them, especially areas that are a little bit less quantified or a little bit less specific. So if a cause area doesn't have a really great evidence base, those funders tend to want to talk to people pretty in-depth, either know them or have someone who knows them, who they're kind of speaking to. So you really do kind of want to get your hands dirty in terms of getting towards areas where you'd be able to talk to people about your project. And I actually think that targeting funders specifically isn't always the right call here. It's more like talking to a whole bunch of people that might like your project, think it's cool, give advice, kind of this sort of thing. And funders will be mixed in with that crowd. So something like an Effective Altruism Global or a conference that's kind of relevant or applicable to the area that you're fundraising for is a really good place to meet lots of people. And you just kind of want to be able to pitch your idea very, very well to lots of different people. Again, whether they're funders or not, a lot of the time you won't even know. But being able to articulate why your idea is promising, what you're excited about doing, what your sort of needs are, and then kind of impressing successive gatekeepers will eventually kind of get you to significant funders who will be kind of excited to talk to you about your project if you've kind of got a lot of other people excited. In general, funders aren't alien species, right? They're just normal people. So if you're getting a lot of positive response and a lot of excitement from a lot of people at, say, a conference in your relevant discipline, that's a really good sign that there are going to be some funders in and amongst that crowd or friends of that crowd who are going to be excited about supporting the project. So for all donors, there's a bunch of heuristics that can really help in terms of not being irritating or being kind of positive and being a good fit for their funding. One is respecting time. So in general, people are super busy. Everyone's very busy, whether you're running a project or funding a project, but you really want to be conscientious of this. So meandering long proposals where you don't really understand what the heck's happening until the end, that's the sort of thing that you want to cut out. Showing up on time, is pretty straightforward, and kind of making the ask for time very small too. So if you can explain everything you need to in a funder in 15 minutes, that's great. You don't need to make it an hour-long conversation if it's just going to be filled with kind of less useful stuff. Another thing that funders look at is signaling and credential borrowing. So when you can say that you've been funded by another funder, or you've been funded by some sort of impressive university or something like this, what people are basically doing is they're assuming that that's a proxy that indicates some level of competence or ability. Not every funder wants to evaluate every single opportunity from scratch. They want to look at kind of quick shortcuts or quick approximations that show that you could be someone who could execute this project to a high level. So that's where signaling really comes in handy, is it's kind of relying on the credibility of the previous vetting. And the more the funder trusts that particular type of vetting, the better. We'll talk about kind of charity entrepreneurship charities and part of why they do so well. But part of why they do well is because previous charity entrepreneurship charities have done well. And now funders kind of look at that project and go, oh, hey, I want to be involved in the next batch of that. So they're kind of using some of the credibility of past historical successful projects who did a similar process. That's a real advantage of having signaling or having kind of programs that you've gone through that others have gone through, especially where the others have ended up having a lot of impact. Next thing is be yourself. So a lot of people are very tempted to kind of like radically change their personality to try to match a funder or something like this. It's really not a good fit. It doesn't work long term. It's very hard to maintain. It's not sustainable. And often funders can see right through it. So I think the real strategy is you want to be quite honest about what your intentions are, what you think is good, what you think is impactful, why you're motivated to do the project, and really try to be much more normal. It's a lot like going on a date or something like that. If you're nervous and trying to impress someone and trying to act, that's not going to work nearly as well as trying to be a little bit more honest and true to what is actually your competitive advantage or your strengths. You definitely do want to paint a picture of the long-term success and vision and what kind of optimistically could happen with your project. Especially in the EA space, you want to balance this with a healthy skepticism. If you say something like, I have a 95% chance of accomplishing X feat, and X feat sounds really hard, people are going to kind of bring up the disbelief, but you do need to have that X. You do need to have that impressive kind of long-term, here's what this is going to amount to or achieve if I do have some success or if I do get some traction. You just need to be aware of what the barriers are to that and what's going to stop. And be really appreciative. Sounds really obvious, but I have all sorts of stories of a funder giving some really small grant that was smaller than maybe the person was expecting, and the person being really negative and not appreciative of it. And of course, that's a funder who's not going to be that interested in talking to you again or recommending you to other funders. So even if it might not be the full amount that you want or this sort of thing, it's really, really important to be kind of positive and appreciative of whatever support you can get. And honestly, getting a little bit of support is a lot way to kind of building up a relationship long term. So you never want to be sad about kind of a small grant. That's half the battle, if not more.
And just to add to that, small donors can turn into very large donors over time. They might start off with a very small grant, and that's their way of like seeing how that goes and building a relationship and building trust, and then it can move into something else.
In many ways, that's the typical expectation. Very few donors are going to give their largest grant the first grant that they give to someone. It's almost always going to be a building up exercise and this sort of thing. And you're kind of building up your credibility in their eyes and your ability to handle funding and do the projects as well. So next, let's talk a little bit about writing. So there's a lot of overlaps with speaking in terms of respecting time and trying to make things concise and this sort of thing. A lot of challenges that people struggle with is getting their ideas super, super clear. So just like an elevator pitch of 30 seconds, you really do want to have kind of a one-page summary of your project that someone could read and grasp and understand right away. People are super busy, and often someone will read something like an executive summary and decide if they want to go deeper into an organization like that. So say we're looking at a funding proposal, and we're kind of thinking about what sort of things this would need to include for someone to have a good sense of whether they actually want to fund that proposal. There's a whole bunch of different elements, and we've lost our slides. There's a whole bunch of different elements, but there's a few things that you basically are going to want to include in all contexts. And one of those is going to be budget, kind of like standard financial information, what you're currently running off of, what would be most impactful to kind of fund, what a higher bound and lower bound budget might be. This is super important. Other things that can include is the long-term vision. So we talked a little bit about how generally kind of having a 5-year vision and a 1-year vision that's a lot more specific are both really important elements. having bios of the senior team or descriptions of the senior team so that people can know if they feel like this is a team that can accomplish that. Part of what you're selling with a project is the essence of the project itself, but you're also selling that you are the team that can actually pull this off successfully, right? So it's not only the idea maybe is 75% of a given proposal, but 25% of it really is describing why you might be the most competitively advantaged person to do it. The EA community is definitely going to look at heavier quantification more. So having an expected value calculation or having an estimate of how much good you're doing over time, that's really important. It doesn't have to be perfect, but having some of those draft numbers and what the key considerations are and what the key factors that would move this up or down is pretty necessary. Formatting matters a lot as well. It really shouldn't in some ways, but if it doesn't look professional or sharp or good, people will use that as an approximation, a kind of sign that maybe you haven't put thought or consideration into other parts of the project proposal that they're not going to have time to dig deeper or vet into. So yeah, that's a few little kind of basic aspects when it comes to funding proposals within effective altruism. It's slightly different when you look outside of effective altruism at kind of more traditional grant structures or grant funding proposals. In theory, you can go to a website and kind of find an exciting grant that seems like a good fit and write that up. In practice, it really, really helps to have some sort of connections. A lot of the time, the writing a grant is actually the last stage in a relationship that you've already been building or already connected, already someone you've met at a conference, this sort of thing. So we have a rubric that will be linked out about what kind of makes a good grant, but it's a lot of similar things in terms of writing. You've got to be able to explain the mission really well. You got to be able to explain what your particular role is, who the other actors are in the process, all these sort of aspects. And the other thing to notice is outside of the effective altruism movement, getting grants is usually very, very slow. So the timelines on these sort of things might be 6 to 12 months, depending on if it's a larger foundation or if it's a government grant or this sort of thing. So often you end up doing this kind of ramp up in terms of moving to slower funders who have longer timelines as you kind of get more and more established as an organization, and then those longer timelines aren't quite as significant. Governments are very much at the extreme side of this, often very, very slow in making grants, but with very large volumes. In general, when you're a brand new project, individuals, high net worth donors, or foundations that are pretty comfortable with funding new and early stage projects are kind of the best bet to look at. These are the people who are actually going to be able to consider a proposal in its earliest stages instead of looking for an org that's been established for a huge number of years. So a really common question that people think about is how much? And I think people often think about this in the wrong frame. A lot of people think, okay, how much is this funder going to give me? And how do I make an ask that kind of fits that amount? That's really not the way you want to go about it. What you want to do is you want to kind of budget out your organization and think about what's the optimal level, which gives you kind of the peak impact. Not the peak impact as in the most possible impact. Maybe if you had 10 times more funding, you could do a little bit more impact, but kind of where you start to hit diminishing returns or where your kind of curve starts to edge off. And this gives you a really strong, compelling ask for what your total budget is. Now, when you have that total budget ask, say for the sake of this conversation, it's 200,000. You might not ask a given funder for 200,000 if they only ever give $50,000 grants. You might ask them for a portion of it or a segment. But knowing specifically how much you need to do the most impact is much more important than knowing exactly what the funder typically funds or typically asks for. And then you kind of approach funders afterwards once you have a sense of your scope.
Just to add to that, just to add to that, that you can make it very clear what they'll get and how much of the overall program that you're asking for funding from them from. So you can say like, hey, this amount of money will achieve this much, but if we get this amount from you, it'll achieve this much more. And that can be quite enticing as well.
Exactly. A lot of our strongest proposals, and in fact, a lot of proposals that I see that do get funded often have multiple budgetary levels with a kind of a description of what the difference is there. Again, thinking of it as a product, what is the donor buying? Why would they care about you getting twice as much as your minimum string budget? Are there enough benefits there? Does it seem more diminishing returns? And although there's been a lot of pressure, especially in the A movement, to be very ambitious with this, I think you want to be ambitious with your impact. You don't want to be ambitious with your budget. You want to come up with a budget that is going to kind of give you most of that impact as for as small amount of dollars as possible, as good a price as possible. That's what the comparison is going to be. It's going to be people looking at other projects that are asking for maybe similar, maybe less amounts of money, and then pitching that they can do different things.
Yeah, and you can add tiers as well or milestones and say like, this amount of money will get us to this point. And then at that stage, we might come back to you and ask for more to help us to get to the next stage and so on. So you're kind of building on success. And that, I think that's a strong psychological technique where you're really like in it together, you're partnering And success breeds like more funding, which means they're getting to have more impact. A lack of success means no more funding, which means they get to pivot and go somewhere else. And it's very upfront in advance.
Exactly. So we're going to talk a little bit about the landscape, and we're going to go particularly deep into the effective altruism landscape and kind of what are available funders there and what our experiences with them there. But the long story short is there's a lot of different actors, right? Everyone has different priorities and different preferences and this sort of thing. But there are kind of a lot of people looking to give funding at all different kind of cause areas and organizational budget scales and this sort of thing. So yeah, as I said, we'll go a bit deeper into this. One cross-cutting kind of consideration when thinking about all these different funders is how aligned they are. Some funders are going to be very, very similar to your perspective, your point of view, and others are going to be vastly different. And that does change your kind of standard approach to them. If you have a funder who basically really buys into the project, basically could run the project, except they're busy doing whatever funder stuff, that's really great. And that's going to give you a lot more flexibility to use the funds for whatever you think is highest impact and this sort of thing. Typically, as the funders get bigger, they will get a little bit less aligned. They will get a little bit more broad scale where they're focusing on a whole bunch of different things. And you're not their one favorite project. You're one of many, many projects that they support. And you kind of move further out from the funding circles that are kind of most aligned, giving smaller amounts of money, to funders that are giving much larger amounts of funding and then typically are less in line with you. So let's go through.
Sorry, Joey, just one thing. I just added an Airtable to the chat there, which has a more complete list of many of the funders as well. So I thought that'd be a useful resource. It'll also be linked to in the slide deck that we send you afterwards as well, but just kind of sharing it now for completeness.
Yeah. So let's go through some of these networks. One network that's a good example of this is the seed funding network that funds charity entrepreneurship charities. So basically the process of how charity entrepreneurship projects get funded is we have them go through this 2-month program. It's very intensive. It trains them up in a whole bunch of skills. And then we send them out to this seed network of donors. These donors have expressed an interest in entrepreneurial projects. They've typically talked to me or someone else on the CE team a couple of times. They're kind of excited and hungry to look at these projects as they come out. And this is an example of a highly aligned network. These people are going to have very similar interests to the people actually going through the CE program. They're going to be impact orientated. They're going to be excited about scrappy projects. They're going to be pretty comfortable with risk. This is kind of a really nice network because many of the same arguments that would kind of convince yourself to start a project might be the same kind of network that would convince the same sort of arguments that would convince that network. So if you can find donors like this, often it's high net worths, often it's people who come from some sort of similar background or that sort of thing, that can be really fantastic. And yeah, moving on to small funders, a little bit broader, but often you can find small funders who share this sort of value, particularly if it's kind of a group of funders who are either very loyal to the cause area or very loyal to the specific idea. Often volunteers might fall into the small funder category. The con of small funders is you have to build up a really big base to get significant support. So often small funders are more of an augmentation as opposed to the exclusive thing. And especially with a small scale project, you probably won't have tons of knowledge out there, tons of people following you who could be small funders. So often for a small project, the first step would be something like a high net worth funder. And this is what a lot of our seed networks are.
And just on the small funders, no harm in always having a button on your website that says, hey, if you want to donate a few quid, they're the people that, again, can start very, very small and then can indeed over time become a little bit bigger. But also, it's just a nice way for people to engage and give you feedback that they like what you're doing. It might be the biggest chunk of money in the world, but it's certainly worth the half an hour or hour of whatever it would take to set it up on your website and get that stream of money coming in.
Yeah, that's definitely true. That's definitely true. And a nice thing about small funders is that because they're naturally really dispersed, they don't carry some of the kind of risks that might come with having a single funder who's covering a really large percentage of your budget. Although that will happen a lot with early stage projects, that you will have one primary funder who's doing a lot of the net funding. So for small scale projects, often your bread and butter will be high net worths. So basically people who are donating pretty significant chunks. This could be because they have a lot of money or because they're donating a really significant portion of their income. Either way kind of works, but they're making pretty large donations relative to what someone would be donating through a donation button or something like this. The nice thing about that is there's a million high net worths, a lot of people who are kind of fitting this category. So you can often find people who are really, really interested in your specific project. Maybe they have some sort of passion towards it or this sort of thing, and that can be a really great way to start. Often high net worths are much quicker too. So going back to kind of the responsiveness, a nice thing about a high net worth donor is it is fundamentally an individual who you're talking to. So it's not like there has to be a huge amount of kind of legal due diligence or bureaucratic steps that need to be taken if a high net worth is particularly sold on your project.
In my project, we were very fortunate to get funded very early on by one individual, and it turned out that he offered an awful lot more than money as well. Like there's a reason he's a high net worth individual. He's very smart and very conscientious. So not only did he want to give us his money, obviously he also wanted to give us his advice, of course, and that's been hugely valuable as well. So there's a little bonus there.
Yeah, and it's hard to overstate the importance of advisors. I mean, in and of themselves, advisors are really important, but they are also often having a really good advisor network is kind of the pathway into funders or talking to kind of people who would be interested in supporting the project long term. So that's another way to kind of start to build out these connections if you don't have necessarily a seed network that you can rely on. Think about who are the 10 people who'd give the best advice on this project. And those people, if they aren't funders themselves, probably know funders who would also be able to support projects if they're really excited about it. So kind of next stage up is foundation funding. Now, foundations range a pretty wide gamut from very, very large to fairly small, kind of in the ballpark of high net worth individuals. And they also range the gamut in terms of speed. They're almost always faster than governments. They're almost always slower than high net worths, though. So that's a good fit. Typically, foundations want to see a little bit of progress. They won't be funding a project that has nothing unless they have a lot of confidence in the individual founding it out. So using kind of these smaller funders and high net worth funders to establish a bit of a track record and a bit of a show that you're able to accomplish your goals really is the kind of key to getting foundation funding. Plus, knowing what the foundation is looking for, maybe talking to them at a conference, these sort of aspects. A thing that we're going to repeat a whole bunch of times, but it really is the secret, is the better your project is, the easier it is to get funding, and the lower your price tag is, the easier it is to get funding. So if you go to a foundation and your project looks twice as good as every other project applying and is asking for half as much money, it's really hard for them to not be excited to fund that. So that sort of aspect can be really, really significant. And I think a big part of why, a lot of the CE projects have had success is they have started with kind of quite a good output relative to the price tag of what they're looking for. And of course, expectations change. You know, if you're asking a foundation for a huge grant, they are going to look for more of a track record. They are going to look for a more impressive background. They are going to look for kind of more of these checkboxes to be checked off. Moving on, government and corporate funding. So government funding, we talked about a little bit. It's very, very slow, but it can be very large. There are some government agencies that are focused on smaller scale funding, so innovation in funds or this sort of thing. But even those innovation funds that are in theory aimed at early stage projects are often pretty late stage relative to, say, what a high net worth funder would fund. They tend to be projects that do have a bit more of an established track record, maybe have set up in their country of operation, have done a few impressive products that you can kind of look at, and this sort of thing. Corporate funding is a whole different kind of beast entirely. A lot of it is to do with how you make the corporation look. So it's less to do with how kind of mission aligned you are, although that helps because of the branding aspects, but a lot of it's to do with PR and kind of their corporate interests. So that's the thing you really want to keep in mind. Sometimes you can find really nice alliances in a corporate funder, especially with them offering free goods or services. You know, the Against Malaria Foundation has gotten a lot of corporate support in terms of people offering services, and that's pretty common, that the services will be easier to get than the commensurate price tag in financial donations from corporate funders. So we're going to deep dive the funding landscape within EA.
Cool. So just for emphasis, that here are a few of the funders, but there are a lot more than this, and I'm going to go into 4 or 5 of them now in a little bit of detail to give you a bit of a picture. Like I said before, some of these slides we're not going to cover everything that's on them, but you will have them as a resource afterwards. So apologies if it feels like I'm going very, very fast. The first funding organization I think makes sense we should look at is EA Funds. You know, this is the organization that is trying to fill the gap that probably most of you that are here are seeking. That's their remit, that's their gamut. They really do go after a very wide variety. So everything from scholarships for individuals, to research, to direct work in specific fields, to upskilling, to seed funding for new organizations, and all the way up to movement building for the animal movement or the EA movement itself, or even the long-termism movement as well. So, you know, there's a very wide range. there's three major funds that they have at the moment that are open: the Animal Welfare Fund, the Long-Term Future Fund, and the EA Infrastructure Fund. And these are essentially independent. They have relevant experts and advisors in each field. They're like case officers, right? So there's a bunch of case officers that are specific to the animal field, for example, and they try and make it as quick and as easy to apply. And they're always encouraging people to apply and make more good applications. They have more money than they are able to give away. Maybe I shouldn't say that so simply, but I think that's true. And so the money is there, but you need a project that's above their bar in terms of expected value or impact. So, it is about getting to the point where you understand the expected value of your project and you're able to do those calculations and you're able to talk about them. And, this is my confidence interval for this, or this is why I think this is likely to succeed, and, all these kinds of things. So they really are looking for that kind of language. These are their payouts over the last while. And then you'll have these slides afterwards, so you can look at these in detail. I think it's really worthwhile actually looking at what they funded and how much they funded. So here's a project. Oh, look, in January 2022, they did this, they did that. And it gives you a really good sense of how much money and where it's going to and the kinds of things that they like to fund. Obviously, this list is not complete. This is another one. This is for Infrastructure Fund. This is for Global Health and Development, and this is for animals. Okay, so they're all in your slide deck. You'll get them afterwards. Obviously, they're not complete because a lot of the smaller projects don't want, they prefer to remain anonymous or whatever. So there's a lot of much smaller projects that are probably in between these larger ones that we're seeing in the lists. I got in touch with some people in EA funds and asked them a whole bunch of questions, and I'm kind of shrinking everything that they came back to me with and trying to condense it into a few short points. They roughly do about 400 grants a year. Most of these are between 5 and 100,000 euros or dollars, sorry. And one org can make, in many cases, actually make multiple applications. So, one org might get 4 grants of 120 grand each. So that's not uncommon. When I pushed them for advice, they kind of went straight into the more technical stuff around theory of change, making sure that you can backchain from what you see as the most pressing problem and make sure that you're tackling a thing that actually matters. I'll be talking later about this theme again, but so many people seem to be coming at them with projects that are nice, but not very impactful. They seem like a good idea because other people have done similar things, but actually this problem will probably get solved itself. If they don't fund you, they can fund somebody else, or somebody else will do it anyway. So just be very careful that you're going to them with a problem that's properly scoped out, that's a very significant or harsh problem, and one that you have a plausible solution for that has a good theory of change. Try to prioritize your reasoning transparency when you go to the EA funds. They're EAs, so they really like that kind of thinking. Don't try and sound impressive or accomplished. They don't like that kind of thinking. Okay, so much more honest than you might see elsewhere. In terms of near misses, why people have come close but not quite got the funding from them. So these are generalizations, obviously, from a couple of the case officers, but basically it's aiming too low in terms of impact. Going after something that's good, that definitely will be of benefit, and the principle, the entrepreneur is, yeah, look, this will really help and it'll move the bar on this thing or move the dial on this thing. Yeah, sure, EA funds would agree with that. It's just that they don't believe that there isn't something more beneficial that they can do with their money. And until you're really dealing with the counterfactuals of what you're proposing and you're saying, hang on, not only is this going to be very impactful or has some probability of being very impactful, there's nothing I can find that would be more impactful. And that's a very much more elusive category to look for. And I think that's one of the reasons why very well researched ideas seem to do so well with this kind of thing. If you do get turned down, the advice is reorientate and consider if the highest impact, if this thing that you're focused on is indeed the highest impact thing that you can do. Don't take it as, oh, they rejected me because they don't understand that it is high impact. They know that it's high impact. They're saying that they think it's not the highest impact thing that you can do. That's the kind of generalized feedback I'm pulling together from talking to them. Another fund is the Long-Termism fund from Longview Philanthropy. So this is, it's grant making managed by Longview Philanthropy, which works closely with OpenPhil and the FTX Future Fund. So it's quite hard to kind of tease these organizations apart and see where the lines actually cut between them. But they're seeking projects that reduce X risks. They promote long-termist ideas or have compelling, transparent cases for their cost effectiveness. And I think this is important to realize, is that a lot of people, in my view at least, and this is just anecdotally from my own experience in EA, is as you move into more long-termist pools of thinking and pools of people, you move away from being as focused on cost effectiveness. But the funders aren't. The funders are really, really keen on what you propose to be very, very cost effective. So keep an eye on that and try and boil things back to, you know, what will actually be achieved by when with this funding. OpenPhil. OpenPhil has OpenPhil do massive grants, and but the part of what they do that applies to most of us here are these kinds of things. So, you know, they want to fund fellowships, and they're worth taking a look at. I'll leave them in the slides. They've recently pushed for outreach and community building project for long-termist projects. They funded 25 and rejected 28 and referred 15 others to EA funds. So they will, like projects that they're not qualified to fund or that aren't really in their remit, they'll just pass them over to EA funds with permission, of course. So these are a few examples of the kinds of things that they have funded: an essay contest, a new quarterly EA journal, a summer program for young competitive debaters, funding for organizations to translate articles into different languages. So these they do go and do quite small exercises as well. So don't rule them out. They're excited to see school-aged in-person programs, meta work, spreading EA ideas, particularly in blogs and podcasts, and getting out there, digital marketing. So I think there's like being quite a sea change in EA, looking very kind of inwardly the last few years, and now we're turning the corner and we're looking much more outwardly and trying to get the messaging out. So translating stuff into different languages other than English as well is another area they're interested in. Next up, and we're barreling through all of this. We're doing really well on time, Joey. So we've got the Future Fund. So Future Fund, although remember there are many other funders out there, but the Future Fund is probably the one that got the most airtime of late. They have done 262 grants and investments totaling 132 million. So they are quite large. They onboarded 150 re-granters who have made 170 or so grants, totaling about 31 million. So they've got all these re-granters, they've got this army of people that are out there looking for great projects. So there is a lot of emphasis on this, and there's a lot that can be done here. They got, as I said earlier, they got 1,700 applications, and they funded about 4% of that through that open applications mechanism. So, you know, when you run the maths on that, that's like 70 projects out of 1,700, I think, thereabouts. What does this mean? Like, why are so many projects being turned down? You know, that's a pretty low hit rate, I think. So I've included a little bit more on the slides, and obviously you can go to the Future Fund and find out all of this. But it is interesting to look at the spread. So you can see the spread, the size of the various grants. So, you know, they did 119 grants of under the 50K mark kind of thing. So that gives you a sense that that would probably apply to a lot of us here. And then 50 to 500K, which would also apply, they did 102 of those. So yeah, they are out there and they're all wanting to do these things. Here on this slide, you'll see the kinds of things that they've invested in a little bit more detail. The vast majority, not surprisingly, going to AI and biorisk and EA building. Notably, though, a whopping 10 million went on empowering exceptional individuals. I think that's kind of interesting because there wasn't that many individuals. So when you kind of think that through, that's kind of fascinating to look at. It's worth checking out their website for more details on their open calls and what they want to fund. But yeah, they're out there, they're doing a lot. And yeah, bio, security, academic surveys, all sorts of stuff, interesting stuff. Okay. Research key, so another avenue I explored when I was pulling this together was simply capturing the key themes that come through when major EA personnel, shall we say, key figures in the EA community speak about funding from their talks over the last couple of years at EAGs and different podcasts and stuff. So I basically watched a bunch of them and then listened to a few podcasts and then kind of tried to go, well, what are the key themes that are coming through here? So the next couple of slides is the distillation of that advice and given fireside chats and talks and interviews on. So first off, it's best when projects are driven by a very specific problem, not like, we need another EA chapter in this or that place. And it's not that we don't need an EA chapter, and that wouldn't be a good thing, but that's not where the funding really wants to flow. But rather, this particular threat to the future is almost completely neglected and tractable. And here is a very tangible thing that we can do about it. It mightn't solve the whole problem, but it'll actually make some inroads on this very difficult problem, or very treacherous problem. So that's what they prefer. Something I've noticed very clearly, and this is reiterated by many of the EA funders and EA speakers, is you've got to have a very clear theory of change, where the chain maps all the way through to real impact. And what I've noticed myself as well, is the start of their theory of change is pretty solid. And then when it gets to the end, it gets super loose, just really, really soft. And if you put your theory of change in front of a bunch of smart people and ask them, again and again, get them to help you identify the weakest links in the chain and either strengthen it or point it out when you're applying and saying, yep, hands up, don't really know what's going to happen at this part of the theory of the change, but that's where the uncertainty lies, and that's why we want to do this test. That's why we want to do this pilot or whatever happens to be. So if you're not sure about something like that, paint it red and make it very obvious that that it's a weakness or a risk in the proposal. Talk to a lot of relevant people. In Training for Good, we've been building journalism programs, shameless plug here, journalism programs, grant making and AI fellowships, and even negotiation skills training. And I managed to get in touch with the author of the most relevant book on negotiation skills. He even offered our users free copies of his book. It was very cool, right? So it's just so worth getting out there and getting a lot of input from a lot of really smart people. And it'll continually surprise you, their perspectives, and you go, oh, of course I should have thought of that. So the more I don't know, what's the equivalent, in your basement you are typing away on your computer, the more removed you are from getting out there and getting lots of people's opinions, I think the weaker your proposals are likely to be. Get it in front of people, get them to turn it inside out, ask for a lot of criticism. And it's far better to get the criticism in advance of sending in your proposal, and then incorporating that criticism or that feedback, making it better, and then sending it in, rather than sending it into the funders and getting that big, the big slam no. If you do try and get in touch with a bunch of experts or advisors and they're really not coming back to you, or it's very, they're not giving you an awful lot of feedback, there's a good chance that your idea probably isn't getting them excited, which means that there's a good chance that the funders will feel the same way. So, it's a good indicator that people in this world are oh, sorry, Joey, I need to unmute you. How's that?
Thanks. Sorry, continue.
Cool. On the CE blog, you'll find some info about our process for iterative depth, which is just something that we've done a lot of work on. But also it just seems to come through in a lot of these interviews and a lot of these talks where, you want to demonstrate that you didn't just land on the idea that you landed on, but that you went through a very robust process and did actually look at a whole bunch of different options that you could have done. And that this is the result of that robust research process. The reason you're going after it in this particular way is because you looked at all the other ways. And as far as you can tell, this is the smartest way of doing it. So yeah, we call that iterative depth. So yeah. Yeah, Joey.
Sorry, I was just going to say that does tie really into something we'll go into in a minute, which is why the CE projects get so much support. A big part of it is just the idea was researched on multiple levels. Every single idea was kind of considered and vetted, and a good heuristic is, have you considered 20 different ideas at least before kind of settling on the idea that you're on? If not, it's going to be hard for that idea to really compete with another idea that has maybe been kind of set through the gauntlet of critical evaluation and kind of compared and turned out as the best relative to a set of reasonable options.
Yeah, I noticed as well, there's a couple of questions and a couple of people saying, yeah, I really want that question answered. I just I can't present and read the questions at the same time. So I'll come back to it in a second when Joey's talking again. Okay, so a little bit more of the generalized advice. With EA funders, do state your uncertainties. Be open and honest about where the strengths and weaknesses are. Like, you might as well admit them. They're going to see them, and it shows that you are conscious of where those weaknesses are, and they're going to work very hard on them. Combine abstract thinking and do cheap tests. So this kind of armchair philosophical, like really thinking deeply about stuff, and then getting out into the real world and testing things, I think is a very powerful approach. And then take risks. It's very clear from a lot of the communications in general, from many funders, that they want far greater upsides and are willing to take bets. The community at large has become far more higher risk appetite, shall we say. So we're looking for those kinds of projects. And then last 2 points, and then I'll hand back over to Joey, is remember that they are evaluating you as a team. Joey mentioned this earlier, but just to reiterate, this is what the generalized advice is as well. They really do check you out behind the scenes, and they'll ask around, and they will, they'll be really interested to see if you've got, if you seem like a credible person, basically. I don't know why I fluffed that sentence. Anyway, you don't need to be, this is another thing that came through quite clearly, is they don't expect you to be 100% an expert in the problem that you're going after, but more that they sense that you will become like 130% obsessed with it if you get the funding, that you are just going to dive right into it and really go deep, and that you will be, you'll bury yourself in the topic. That's the sense that they want to get, rather than, I've been working in this for 10 years. I've never actually done anything with it, but now I want to. That's not as compelling a story. Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
Great. So just wanted to highlight a few things and a few reasons why CE's projects tend to do very well in terms of funding, and very little to do with kind of like standard communications or fundraising advice, and a lot is to do with kind of the project evaluation and composition. So Steve already talked about this a little bit, but iterative depth. Every idea that gets founded, we started with 300-400 ideas, did a bunch of rounds of research, came down to the top 4 or 5, ran an incubation program where people tested out working on those 4 or 5. They picked a particular one as a particularly good fit relative to their skill sets and kind of abilities and this sort of thing. And then that's the idea that goes to the seed network that's already pretty sold on entrepreneurship. So that gives you an idea of just like how broad the scope is of ideas that were considered before kind of picking one of these top organizations that ends up looking really good and really promising. Another thing that was mentioned, but I'll highlight even more, is trajectories versus where the organization is at. Especially for younger organizations, there's not a huge track record that you can rely on. What you're kind of trying to pitch is, what is going forward the organization going to look like? Is this organization going to get really capable and competent and knowledgeable and this sort of thing? And how is the trend of that organization looking? So even in the course of a month, you can start to demonstrate that. Does your organization move fast? Has your organization gotten a lot done relative to the month that it's been in existence? Has your organization written or published anything that looks impressive? A lot of the time, our organizations will have an EA forum post before they apply for their first level of funding. That's great. That gives people a sense of what your research looks like, or what the quality of your work looks like. You're trying to give a window into, if this organization did get funding and support, what would it end up looking like? And hopefully that looking good, and that being compelling for the funder to kind of be excited about and think, hey, I'd love to see more of that. That's always more believable and more credible than kind of an empty promise or an abstract promise that doesn't really dive into A, what's actually going to happen. If they don't know what's going to happen, it's going to be very hard for people to be excited about funding it. Or B, it might happen, but we don't really know what quality it's going to happen at. And that quality aspect is very, very important. So I want to go over a few last little principles that are kind of really, really key. So picking a project carefully, some crazy percentage of fundraising, 50% of it probably, is like picking a really good project at the start. And if you are, a fairly talented individual and people are giving you the sort of feedback of, oh yeah, you seem really cool, but yeah, the project, there's some pros and some cons, that might be a sign that it's the project that's letting you down. Our projects are often strong points for our organizations. We've even heard from certain people, they've said like, oh, your organization did a really bad pitch, but I was really sold on their project, so I supported them anyways. You want to be more in that category than the opposite category, because it's a heck of a lot easier to get good at pitching than it is to radically shift the project into something that's more impactful. So that's bullet point kind of number 1. Number 2 is thinking about broadly who's in your space. So one of the things that we see a lot with people when they're kind of getting to know a space is they'll do something that someone else is already doing or already has done to a really high level of degree, or something that kind of demonstrates they don't actually have that much knowledge of the space. So doing a lot of upfront research. Say you pick a project, in the bed net space, the delivering malarial bed nets. You really want to know who else is delivering malarial bed nets. What's your competitive advantage over them? Why are they underperforming or overperforming? Or what's the kind of niche that you're going to fit into? You basically have to have an awareness of the broader space that you're operating in. Otherwise, it's just not going to seem like you're a fantastic fit for it, because you won't really know where you're going to fit in relative to the other organizations. It's very rare that you're the only person or the first person doing a given project. There's going to be other kind of actors and players in the space, and having a pretty strong understanding of them is fairly essential. So next thing we hit on a little bit before, but really, really stress test and critically apply reasoning towards your idea. So the funder should not be the first skeptical person that you're showing your idea to. They should be the 10th or the 20th or something like that. There should be a lot of people who have looked at this idea and said, hey, what about this flaw? What about this weakness? And that doesn't necessarily mean every time there's a weakness, you throw out the idea and come up with a new one, but you should be damn sure you know where those weaknesses are in your projects. What are the points of vulnerability? And again, critically comparing it to other options in the field. So if I'm making a pitch for malarial bed nets, I better know why bed nets are particularly better than malarial medication, vaccinations, a laser that shoots out and kills mosquitoes. You got to know those kind of relevant comparison classes.
Is there a laser that shoots out and kills mosquitoes? That sounds super cool.
There is, but it's not very cost effective, unfortunately. So you really want to critically evaluate your option. And again, we really don't want to have a good option. You want to have the best option. We're aiming for the most impact here, and funders are trying to get the best possible deal they can. So really hard to emphasize that enough in terms of your project has to be the place in the world that you'd want to donate $1 to, and not just $1 to because you're excited about the project or yourself and you're going to do a good job of it, but that an external outsider would say, hey, this is the project I'm most excited to donate to, or I think is the best investment of a given dollar. So another thing that we talked about a little bit, but I think we want to elaborate on even further, is having a sense of where the heck you're going long term. So it can be really cool to set up some early stage funding, with seed grants or with high net worth about here's what I want to do over 6 months. But having some sort of big ambitious vision of how this becomes really transformative or really significant is really important too. When a grant maker is evaluating an opportunity, it takes them a pretty similar amount of time to evaluate $1 million opportunity and a $10,000 opportunity. They still have to load it into their cognitive bandwidth, evaluate its promisingness and this sort of thing. So if your opportunity is promising but very small scale and has no potential kind of dramatic upside, that's going to be less exciting. And again, I don't mean dramatic upside in terms of funding. You don't necessarily need to be able to absorb $10 million a year. But you need to have dramatic upside in terms of, wow, this really changed something quite significant. How is this going to change the face of the movement? Or how is this going to be radically different from the kind of default option that a donor would support or give to? Having at least a tentative 5-year plan is valuable, even at the early stage. The next one is having a way for people to publicly know that your organization exists. So this is a thing that I see happen with tons of new organizations. They'll exist, they'll have a website, maybe they'll make one EA forum post or something like this, but otherwise they'll have no engagement with the broader world. Your donors are out there in the broader world. If it's really hard for a typical person to find any information about your project or what you're doing or get involved or anything like that, it's going to be really tough for someone who's excited to financially support do the same thing. I often tell our charities when we're starting out, hey, you should check your newsletter subscribers, because if I'm not on it, it means you haven't advertised your newsletter hard enough, because I sign up for every newsletter from a top charity that goes through a program that I see. And there are kind of charities that fall into that fold. There's a lot of charities where a person will reach out because they don't actually know what the charity does. They'll say, oh, this wasn't very clear from its website or wasn't really clear from its public communications. You have to have enough information for someone to actually be able to give you an evaluation. You can't just assume that they're going to go through the trouble of kind of asking you individual questions. That has to be available somewhere. Next thing is, oh yes, very simple. Being honest with funders. You basically just want to be super transparent. Again, it might be really tempting to exaggerate your claims or that sort of thing. It just doesn't work, and it just doesn't work long-term at all. The funding network is very small. People talk all the time about, oh yeah, this person said this claim and then they kind of failed to deliver. If you can, you want to underpromise and overdeliver. And the same goes with your back-checking credentials and this sort of thing. It's very tough because you'll see other projects that kind of maybe are a little bit misleading or something like that, but those projects often don't get funded long term. They often do kind of run into problems when they kind of fail to deliver what they said they were going to do. So when building up a project for the long term, you want to have this reputation of someone who executes really well, is truly honest, and this sort of thing. And we'll talk about this a little bit when it comes to rejecting funding too, which is important. Another very tempting mistake that people make is they kind of imply that they need more funding than they actually need, or imply that they don't have any other funding pending, but there actually is other funding pending, or this sort of thing. You really just don't want to fall into that. It's really important to be honest about what the counterfactual is. And sometimes that means one donor will just be displacing another donor. And you want to be as clear with that with both donors as you possibly can be. So mentioned again earlier, but if you have a budget that makes your project a really great deal, it's going to be a lot easier to get funding for it. Every funder in the world is going to be comparing it to every other project that they get and thinking about how much value does this provide. A great deal doesn't necessarily mean cutting all the corners, but it means the output that you are giving, the kind of value or impact is high relative to the costs going into it. And that does mean if there's two projects that offer about the same output, but one costs twice as much as the other, it makes it an easy call. And that does affect a lot of projects. It's not that you can't get ambitious, and it's not that you can't set your budget higher and higher. In fact, people will want you to, but you got to prove that you can do stuff at a lower level of scale before kind of ramping it up. If the first pitch that we had to a donor was, hey, we want to cover all of India with this particular project, that would be seen as unrealistic. If you've covered a state and then you're talking about expanding to another state, that's the sort of thing where people are excited about seeing the expansion. So setting a budget that is kind of, I think on the leaner side when you're first starting out can be really beneficial. I know there's quite a few questions on that. We'll dive into them.
Yeah, actually, while we're on it, Joey, you might speak to the idea of where should you set your salaries at, because they're going to be a very major component of the budget, particularly in the early days, and just any guidance on where you would encourage people to place their salaries.
Yeah, I mean, they're all over the place. So salaries of early stage charity entrepreneur founders go anywhere from 20 and 30K, really low wage, sub minimum wage wages, all the way up to a couple $100K. But it is more likely to get funded the lower it is. Funders aren't typically looking at the specific budgetary lines. So they're not looking at, oh, this salary is, particularly low or particularly high, but they are looking at the total cost. So they are looking at a project that's asking for 100K versus 300K and going, this 300K project really doesn't look that different from this 100K project, or it really doesn't look that impressive relative to the amount of funding that they're seeking. So the salary budget line isn't specifically targeted, but yeah, I mean, it will be a big component in terms of what's going to do that. If your project proposal is strong enough, normally it's not the salary that's the differentiating factor. If your project proposal has some weaknesses or has some concerns, or people want to see it, then it's easier with a smaller ask.
Also think that it depends on which type of funder you're going to a little bit. So if you're going to a high net worth individual and they're kind of close to the ground and they're not like mega rich or whatever, they're still connected to reality, and you're putting in a huge salary, they're thinking, well, hang on a second, I'm just moving my salary into their salary. That's a bit crazy. So that I think that you want to demonstrate that you're very value aligned and that you're willing to make some sacrifices as well. So for us in Training for Good, we started off with very low salaries or low salaries. And this made sense. And now that we're seeking more funding or a little bit more established, and we've been at it for a year, we kind of have to kind of acknowledge that we do have some financial needs, and we're ramping it up a little bit. But it's still kind of somewhere, but you're talking about like 30 to 60 grand is the kind of that area that we would place ourselves in. So yeah.
And I would say that funders' perspectives on this range massively. Some funders will be like, oh my God, anything under X bar is a shockingly low salary, and I want people to pay themselves more. Others will say, oh, this seems like a bit of a high salary, and the variance in cause area is pretty significant as well. So perhaps unsurprisingly, AI areas have the most kind of sympathy for salaries. And the areas that are kind of more fiscally frugal, not necessarily as overfunded, like poverty, tend to be frugaler, tend to be leaner. Great.
So learn to do better over time.
Exactly. The last bullet point that's kind of important to cover is just trying to get better over time. So every time you pitch a project or explain your project, you want to get a read on, is this coming across? Is this person understanding it? Can this person kind of articulate why this project is excited? Is this person excited about it in general? that sort of stuff will that's your feedback loop, right? That's essentially whether you're getting kind of positive reception. Again, this is why a conference can be really beneficial, because you're explaining your project to tons of different people and you can test out different framings, different explanations, different examples, and some of them are going to suck, and that's fine. You toss them away. If a lot of them suck, if it's really hard to get anyone excited, maybe that's a sign that you need to go back to the project reevaluation phase. But kind of learning to improve your message over time, and especially as you ramp up your funding requests, you will have to get better at communication. You have to get a bit more polished. You have to get a bit smoother. You have to include more detailed models about your impact. All that stuff needs to kind of improve as your project improves. Although you will get, staff and specialization of this sort of stuff as projects get bigger as well. So there will also be some differentiating factors that kind of come up that way. And the last thing that I want to cover a little bit on this is when to say no. So one thing that's a bit weird about charity entrepreneurship is we've turned down quite a lot of funding. There have been funding offers that have not been a good fit, and our top charities have turned down funding offers as well. And this can happen for a couple of reasons. One, you cannot utilize dollars more effectively. And this isn't to say that there's nothing charity entrepreneurship could possibly do with an extra dollar. Of course there is, but
you could pay me a higher salary, Joey.
No, we're talking about reasonable options here.
Oh,
Steve.
sorry, Joey. Sorry.
There's always something that you can do with an additional dollar, but how much extra impact does that additional dollar generate? There is kind of a curve for every organization, kind of the peak funding amount, the kind of amount that you're going to do a lot of your good for the most minimal amount of funding. Knowing when that is, and knowing that you can turn down funding at that point and just say very politely, thank you so much for considering us. We actually are full, room for more funding. I think there's probably other projects that can make better utilization. That's actually really, really great. And that funder is going to be much more sympathetic if you ever approach them and say, hey, we do need funding, because they know you're not just a money absorbing machine that is going to take every dollar in possible and spend it immediately. So I think that's really important. Another reason to say no is sometimes a funder will put strings that prohibit the impact of your mission. And this can be really, really tough, especially when you have some impact-aligned funders and some less impact-aligned funders. There are going to be funders who want to kind of change a project subtly or radically. I would suggest a huge level of caution with this. Almost every project I know that has taken money with significant kind of byproducts or strings or pivots has regretted it. And almost every project I know that has turned that down has thought that it's the right call. It's easier to take some money, but often if you are prioritizing impact, there are other funders who are prioritizing impact. And by kind of deprioritizing that, you're moving away from those other people who'd be excited to kind of support a project from an impact-based perspective and from a more aligned perspective of what you want to do long-term. So that can be another reason to say no, is if it results in kind of a pivot or a moving away from your mission. So yeah, although funding does seem like, a very difficult thing to get, sometimes it can be the right call to turn it down, and definitely has happened with our charitable organizations. Great. So I think now, sorry, Steve, how are we doing for time?
We're doing great. There's a few questions in, so I could ask a couple of those, and then we can see if there's more questions coming in, and we'll do our best. So I might just direct the questions at you, Joey, and then you can just answer them off the cuff.
Sounds great.
So if you get turned down, let's say you apply to EA funds or something, should you reapply? And actually, I might answer this first, and then you can chip in as well.
Yeah.
So should you reapply? And so the answer is most certainly yes. We got turned down a bunch of times, but we weren't really turned down. We were told, no, we're not going to fund you. And then we said, well, can we have some feedback? And then we got into essentially a conversation, and we listened and we pivoted and we tried to talk to them if possible. And so I think what you're trying to do is you're trying to tease it apart. Are they turning you down because your thinking isn't robust enough and they don't think that you could possibly manage this project? Or do they think the project itself isn't good enough? And you're trying to pick that apart. And I think in our case, we were lucky enough to get some feedback that they thought we could do it, but the thing that we were trying to do wasn't quite right yet. And we went off to talk to a bunch of advisors, and then really kind of implemented a lot of feedback, really made some quite significant changes to the projects, and then focused in, narrowed our focus, and then went back to them. And then lo and behold, we got funded. I have a very small sample set, so I can only speak to that.
No, I think that applies to the broader sample set as well. Virtually every funder will say they're excited to have you reapply, and they will be genuinely excited. They won't hold past applications against you. On the other hand, funders don't change their criteria massively. So if you reapply with the exact same application, you're probably going to get the same result. The question is, how do you improve that application? And what were the problems within the first place? So exactly as Steve said, is it a project problem? Is it an execution? You need to show some proof of execution. What's kind of the barrier for you moving to that next step? So would I recommend improving in the ways that you think are most likely the weaknesses of your projects, ideally getting feedback from the funder directly, but also feedback from the world? Those correlate a lot. Yeah, definitely improve the project, reapply, or pivot the project, reapply, that sort of thing. I think very few funders are going to see it. I mean, most funders aren't even going to notice, honestly, because they're just getting so many applications and the rejections just go in a pile and they're not like rechecking that sort of thing. But even the ones that do notice typically don't see it as a negative sign.
Cool. A question that's kind of come in a few different parts is what goes into a funding proposal? What are the headlines, or can we see a template? And yeah, what's most important?
Yeah, we can share a template. I mean, the most important is the executive summary page that kind of covers everything really distilled really shortly so that people can read it. But some things that you'd never kind of have a CE charity walk out of our program without doing, an estimation of how much impact you're having. So a formal cost analysis of some sort is really great. A theory of change, as Steve mentioned, a budget, both long-term and short-term, some sort of 5-year vision as well as a 1-year vision, some sort of description of what your team is like. All those things are very, very essential. Some sort of description of the problem, assuming it's not a super obvious problem. Even if it is a super obvious problem, kind of describing how many people it affects and that sort of thing. Why your solution is particularly competitively advantaged versus other possible ideas. That sort of thing. A lot of the time, you do want to be able to distill your message down to a really short form, though. So although like a 10-page proposal can look really shiny, you'd be amazed at how much of the impact comes from that first page. And that's where it comes more to the strength of the idea as opposed to being able to present it super well.
Cool. Well, as Joey said, we'll find a template and we'll put it in, or an example or two, or we'll put them in the slide deck when we send that out after the session.
Yeah. I should also say, sorry, this varies a ton between EA and non-EA funders. Non-EA funders will have some different requirements. Maybe they'll have like specific kind of framing that they want to see. So for instance, I know a non-EA funder who's very excited about end games, kind of wants to hear how eventually you're going to get sustainable outside of foundation level funding. Sometimes that's really important, sometimes that's not. But all those things that I mentioned are pretty essential for most funders. Maybe the cost analysis you wouldn't need with non-EA funding groups or non-impact oriented funding groups. But definitely a theory of change, definitely a description of your team, definitely your 5-year and 1-year vision, all that sort of stuff is you're going to have in all cases.
Mm-hmm. Another source of those proposals is sometimes by going on the websites of the kinds of charities that have, for example, that CE has started, and they'll actually have them there. They're part of their transparency. This is what we sought funding for, and this is how we did against that. So I think that's kind of cool. Joey, let's say somebody's offered funding, and they don't 100%. I'm guessing from the way the question's phrased, not 100% sure that they believe in the proposal, but that's what the grant maker's job is to evaluate the quality of the proposal. So should they kind of defer to that person, or this whole EA humility problem of people having imposter syndrome might be there as well. I don't know. There's all sorts of factors in that maybe. And if I've misinterpreted your question, please re-ask it, by the way.
Yeah. So this is a tricky thing. The one thing I'll note here is, yes, funders can be smart sometimes, cannot be other times. But funders are not putting a huge amount of time into every individual proposal, right? So in terms of a funder thinking a proposal is good, but you having a bunch of insider knowledge and being more skeptical of it, I wouldn't trust that the funder is going to be a higher form of impact evaluation unless the funder's really, really thorough. So I mean, if GiveWell said, hey, we'd love to give you an incubation grant, like, sure, because they're extremely thorough and would only give an incubation grant to a project that looked really, really promising. But typical funders, I mean, they're spending on the order of hours considering your project. They're not considering it as their full-time job or for weeks or months. So you do want to have kind of a higher level of understanding and a higher level of soldness. If you're starting to get that from everybody, so say you pitched it to 30 people, including some funders and some wise experts in this sort of thing, and especially people who have a little bit more of an understanding of the project, and they all say, hey, this is really great, then maybe it veers a little bit more into imposter syndrome, maybe some concerns about whether you can, execute it or this sort of thing. So I guess if everyone's saying it's great, I take that as a sign. If a single funder is saying it's great, imagine that they did just spend 1 or 2 hours considering it. It's not necessarily a strong endorsement that this is a project you should dedicate your life to. The burden's a little bit on you, unfortunately, to really investigate the project and make sure that you're sold on it. Funding is a slight positive update, but only small.
Yeah, and really like spreading out the where you're deferring to a bunch of advisors is just generally smart as well. Joey, how would you think about somebody who's applied for funding and they're waiting for that to come back maybe, and then also applying for upskilling so that they can do the concrete project when they get the funding?
Yeah, I mean, I think that imagining the set of skills you have and upskilling to be able to capacity run that project, people are pretty sympathetic to. So I think a lot of the time, if it's concrete and specific, like, I think I need A, B, and C, and I have A and B, and I need to train up in C, and here's how I'm going to do it. I think that people end up being pretty sympathetic to that, and I think that's a good idea. I think you can even do this simultaneously while applying for funding. So you can kind of apply for funding and say, I have A and B, and I'm working on C right now by building up this thing. I think that's fine to kind of simultaneously train up. Again, it's about trajectory and potential. If you need to learn 10 skills and you don't have a track record of learning 10 skills in the past, that's going to be a tougher sell, right? Because people don't necessarily know what your skill acquisition is. If you have a history of acquiring some skills independently or in a certain way, whether that's a degree or whatever else, and then you're planning to acquire more skills that way, then people will have more sympathy to that.
Under what circumstances would somebody want to stay anonymous? So this was basically like, why would I want to stay anonymous? Because sure, even if the project fails, I'd want to share that with people.
Yeah, I mean, I think transparency is a really good default. Sometimes projects stay anonymous when they have a political nature. So if you're going to go against big tobacco, maybe you don't want to publicly announce that you're going to be working in a specific country or that sort of thing. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes people are worried about information hazards. So if you're doing something particular and biorisk that you don't want a whole bunch of media attention to go to. Sometimes people are just a bit worried about their personal reputation. Like, oh, what if I do this project for 6 months, decide I don't want to do it, and then I kind of look like a flake. Sometimes that happens too. But I think that I think people lean more towards anonymity than makes sense in a lot of cases. Normally, it's good to hear that you're getting funding, and even if it does result in the project failing 6 months down the line, most of the time people are excited to see someone who's tried something, even if that something hasn't had the success that they would have ideally hoped.
Cool. Thoughts on part-time versus full-time? So you're proposing to do a project, but you're only proposing to do it part-time. Does that diminish the credibility or anything like that?
Yeah, massively. It's really hard to do projects. They're right at the edge of, I mean, the best projects are really ambitious, right? And they're like right at the edge of whether you're able to do them or not. Being part-time, especially if you're, say, the only founder, being part-time, that's super, super tough. I often say with our CE projects, we like projects that are kind of between 1.5 full-time equivalent co-founders and 2.5 full-time equivalent founders. So it's not that there's no flexibility. Maybe you have one full-time founder, one part-time founder, and that sort of thing. But the projects where both the co-founders are part-time or there's one co-founder and they're part-time, very, very tough for that to compete its way up to the top of your priorities. And people are rightfully skeptical because those projects tend to not work as much. So it's tough. It's definitely a con. Tons of people will see it as a con.
Okay. Question I'm trying to wrap my head around myself is, so I'll just read it out in its entirety, Joey. It seems like on day one of a project's launch, existing organizations working in a space are likely to be a more cost-effective bet than the new project, even if they're only solving a small fraction of the total problem, and the project may need some time piloting to identify its competitive advantage, for example. How do you balance the desire to shape the project through experimentation with the need to produce a cost-effectiveness analysis up front?
Yeah. Okay. So your cost effective analysis is not on your project year one. What you need to show is what your cost effectiveness will look like when your project is at a reasonable level of scale. So even very, very cost effectiveness oriented owners like Charity Entrepreneurship and GiveWell and this sort of thing, they're not looking at your cost effectiveness the first month or two, or even the first year or two. What they want is a model that when it is at a certain level of scale will look cost competitive with the top players. So when you're doing a CEA, you are extrapolating out. You're going, okay, well, we're going to imagine that we're going to have 10 staff, we're going to be overhead, and we're going to imagine that we're going to have this direct delivery cost, and we've kind of got this reason that we think it's going to be more cost effective and that sort of thing. It's absolutely right that day one you will not be cost competitive with already established actors. Not a chance. It's just not going to happen, at least with any direct delivery intervention. But that's not what people are looking for. What people are looking for is a trajectory where if they support you and if you grow well for 3 years, you're going to be more cost effective at scale. So that's where your modeling goes to, and that's what you'd kind of be putting in numbers wise.
Yeah. Okay, there's a couple more questions in, but I do recognize that we are at time, and we did say at the start we were definitely going to end on time. Yeah, so like just basically apologies. Obviously, we can't get to everybody all of the time. If you have a burning question and you really want to get it answered, by all means, send me an email afterwards. I'll do my best. If it's on the more technical end, I'll see if I can find somebody to ping it through to you as well. But yeah, we'll do our best. And guys, I just want to say thank you so much for coming. Hope it was useful. And yeah, best of luck with getting your project funded. I hope it all works out. So thanks very much.
Sounds great. Thank you for attending.